So, I've officially started my new semester of school. However, in the meantime, I did finish Franz Kafka's The Trial. A couple notes about this book. It's number one, it is an unfinished work. Supposedly, the way this happened is that Franz Kafka had a very long history of destroying his own work after creating it or during the creation of it, because it wasn't perfect enough or wasn't good enough. And so in this instance, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, unfortunately, but a friend of his took the manuscripts that were basically bundled together a little bit by chapters away before it could be destroyed, and that later became The Trial, along with some other documents and pages. So parts of it are unfinished, parts of it are omitted but added in at the very end through an appendice. So a little bit confusing of a book in the first place, right? Second big thing about this book is really, I think, kind of the way that Kafka wrote it, in a sense, because it's unfinished and it's not like properly reviewed and edited. I can't guarantee that this is the point of what I was going for, but one of the really hard things about reading this book is that there are paragraphs that go on for pages and pages and pages. I think there was a paragraph in there that was like 10 pages long. And I think that is in part to help put the reader into the same sense that Joseph K., our main character, finds himself in. It's just a confusing world that it just seems to draw on forever and ever and ever without really any sort of break or defining conclusion. So I think that's my first interpretation of the way that the novel itself is laid out in. So I think that's the big main initial part of looking at this. I think the second big part about this is looking at the story itself. In, I think, a lot of people's minds, right? This is another novel that gets talked about a lot and gets kind of just put out there into the minds of people, but people don't inherently read it. And so there's this vision of the world that Joseph K. is living in as being some kind of sort of dark dystopian world, but it's not. It's the real world, is the world that they were living in at that point. There's nothing really different about it. The only difference is that there's this sudden addition of this council that just exists, right? That's the only difference there. So I think that's first a huge step to make. Yeah. Secondly, we get into the actual proceedings of the trial, right? And the trial itself, the whole point of it is that Joseph K. is being arrested for something that he did not do, supposedly. But more importantly, he's being arrested with no actual pretense as to why he's being arrested. No one will tell him why. And in fact, no one actually knows why, because those decisions are made by people who are higher up than him. And because those decisions are made up higher up than the people that he's dealing with, none of them actually know. They're just doing their jobs in arresting him and eventually executing him. They're just doing their jobs. A lot of the story, I don't think, is inherently necessary. I think this is like an incredibly dark comedy. It feels so much like a farce. And everything's being put onto display for Joseph K's effectively amusement. They're there to show that, oh, things are actually happening, but in reality, his decision has already been made. The thing that will happen to him, the fact that he will be found guilty, even though he will never know exactly what he's been found guilty of, will always exist. But everything leading up to that really doesn't seem super important in the end. If anything, right, the big thing to me that stands out is the conversations that he has with the painter, and then the conversation that he has with the lawyer at one point. With the last conversation he has with the lawyer, when he is trying to get rid of the lawyer, or trying to dismiss the lawyer of his duties. In the conversation with the painter, there's a lot of talk about how it is a farce. What is happening is effectively a farce, and that the trial's already been decided. And the only way that Joseph can be let out and acquitted is through effectively postponing everything, whether that be through forcing the case never actually start, or doing this whole thing of he gets an affidavit to then say that he is acquitted, but then they can be reviewed by the higher courts, and the higher courts can still have him arrested again and just do the same process over and over and over again, right? With that being said, one of the big things that comes about is this idea of how for a lot of people in power, the law and what the law actually says doesn't really matter to them. What really matters to them is if they can do what pleases their friends and the people that hold power, right? Huge thing, right? Huge thing that, especially, this was initially written in 1910s, I think 1915, 1916, Germany, but still extends to this point, right? The laws are not inherently known by people. We know the gist of them, but really what matters is, do we have people in high enough places that care about the laws, or care about avoiding the laws? We see this all the time. America's a very big place. A lot of things like this happen, in which either the people that are supposed to uphold the laws, or the people that are supposed to be putting the laws into action in the first place, do so in a way that allows the people immediately around them, or friends with them, or confidants with them, to get away with things. And to be a person who is outside of that situation, it's incredibly frustrating, and it's tiring, which is the same thing that Joseph K finds himself in, because Joseph K is just the every person. Joseph K is the one that doesn't have the connections. He happens to have an uncle who has a connection to a lawyer who has a connection, but he doesn't inherently have the connections along with everyone else. So I think that's a huge point there. Is this overall idea of what's really happening is that his decision has already been made, unless he can convince anyone else through power and through money and through being a friend of his innocence. It does not matter if he's actually innocent. What matters is, does he have friends in the right places to tell everyone else that he's innocent? Second really big thing is the conversation with, let's talk about the lawyer, right? And the lawyer kind of goes back and forth about, you think that your stuff is being mistreated, here's how we actually mistreat people. And it shows that dichotomy between Joseph, who has an in with a lawyer, and therefore the lawyer is nicer to him and more willing to accept him, and Block, who has no connection whatsoever, right? In that instance, Joseph has the higher power and has the connection, and therefore is treated much better. But Block gets treated like a dog. He is groveling on his hands and knees, despite having gone through this for 5 years at that point. He is groveling on his hands and knees for any bit of information. And the information that he's given is, your trial hasn't even started yet. Block has given up everything. He has given up mountains and mountains of money just to hear this information that his trial has not even started yet. Versus Joseph, who is allowed to walk in basically whenever he wants and gets way more information just because he has an in, right? And so we see this immediate difference between hierarchy. We have the people who have all the connections that are being accused. There's Joseph kind of in the middle here, who has some connections, but they aren't really deep. And then we have Block, who has no connections. So we have Block who has no connections, right? I think that's another huge part of all of this, is that there is this sort of classism that's going on when it comes to information and when it comes to being able to do anything with their trials. Is that the people who have no connections are spent groveling and giving everything, trying to get anything out of it. Well, Joseph, although it certainly reflects on his mind a lot, isn't inherently giving up anything. And then we have the people who would have all the connections that are being accused that don't have to worry about anything, right? So I think that's another huge part of this. Other big part is the discussion at the very end with the priest about, there's the whole story of before the law. And it's basically the priest trying to discuss with Joseph about what, like, the situation that he's actually in, right? And basically what it comes down to is that the people who are gatekeeping information from him, literally gatekeeping information from him, are just doing their jobs. And he, as someone who is trying to ascertain the law and trying to figure out the law and trying to obtain the law, just has to figure out the right question to ask and the right thing to do. And that's all there is to it, right? From the priest's eyes, from the eyes of the court, that is what the court really thinks. Because to the court, all of their officiatings, right? The fact that they keep everything in secrecy, the fact that they don't record anything, all comes down to the fact that all the accused has to do is ask or say the right thing. To them, that's all that has to happen. But if you're not given any information, right? If you are the accused and you're not given any information on how to proceed, where to go, what to do, well, then all you are is stuck waiting. And that's why that there's this initial argument between Joseph and the priest, is because the priest is from the court. Yes, cat, hello. Are you upset? Are you upset? It's because the priest is from the court, and so sides with the court's beliefs. But Joseph is an accused person, and Joseph has no understanding of the way the court works, right? And so there's this, I mean, it's just the difference. There's a word that I want to use there, but there's this difference between the two of them, which can never be bridged because they're coming at the same issue and looking at the same story from completely different sides of information balance, right? So I think that's a huge thing. And to me, that's the big thing in all of this, right? Is understanding the way that you look at an experience or at a topic versus how someone else will, and actually being able to view that you're coming from different points, right? I think that's one of the really big things about this. And then we get to the end. The end, of course, very, very short. And it involves with Joseph getting executed by just two guys. They are nobodies. They're just guys, right? And what ends up happening, right, is that Joseph effectively concedes himself to his fate, right? He concedes to the fact of what is happening. He sees Fräulein Burster, and initially attempts to give chase to try to save himself, or tries to interact with police officers to try and save himself, but quickly gives up on that and just accepts his fate, right? He accepts his fate that he's going to be executed and found guilty of whatever it is and not fight it. But in the very last seconds, as he is about to be stabbed, he's up against a rock, and like a window like opens up across the road or river or something that Joseph can see. And in that moment, Joseph reaches out and tries to get the attention of whoever opened the window. And in that moment, he is stabbed. And then Joseph, as his dying words, says, "Like a dog." And it's because in that moment, right, he has played exactly into what the court was trying to get all along. In that last second of trying to reach for hope and cling on to something, he is no longer the martyr that he has been trying. He decided that he was going to try to be. There's the story of the lawyers earlier, in which the lawyers, basically someone at the top of the stairs flinging them down to try to stop the lawyers getting into court, and the lawyers just one by one keep going up and up and up and up until the person at the top eventually stops. And really, it's kind of meant to be the idea of futility in things, right? And what Joseph has done in that instance is deciding, I'm not. Initially, when he goes out and he stops trying to chase after Fräulein, or stops trying to chase after police officers, he accepts his fate. He no longer is trying to fight against futility, fight against this overwhelming thing, until the very last second. And he becomes just like everyone else, reaching out for that glimmer of hope. He becomes a groveling dog, like Block the Trade Master, or like the lawyers, or like the examining magistrates, who are all just dogs at the people at the feet of people who are higher above them. And to me, that's the entire point of this, is that Joseph, in the end, even after all of this, is in the exact same position as he would have been at the very beginning. He is just as much the mercy now as he was then, despite everything, despite his own trials and tribulations, right? He is still at the same point. He is still going directly into the hands of what the people above him in the court want him to do. Last thing I guess I should note is what my perception of what Kafkaesque is. And I think there's once again from this misunderstanding, I think this from this idea that we read synopses of books and then think we know what the book is, and that gets perpetuated through certain members in certain professions, and therefore there's a misconception, I think, or in terms of miscontrusion, what I personally think is really defined by Kafkaesque, and really because Kafkaesque is not about dystopian future, right? It's not. It's about the world we are living in now being so absurd at what it is. The trial gets into, I think, a big human fear in modern age, in a lack of information about what is happening to you, right? I think it's a huge, huge thing. And I think that's why the trial still is prevalent to this day, right? But I think more importantly, it's about this idea of you're constantly being watched by some overarching authority, but not to commit, not to do cancel culture, right? That's not the point of it. The point of it is that you are so obsessed with this feeling of being viewed and being watched constantly that it becomes an obsession to you, right? That's not cancel culture, right? Certainly cancel culture can be harmful, but in a lot of ways I think that it can certainly be beneficial to society as a whole. What I'm talking about is this idea of we are so subservient to what we think culture should look like, what we think ideas and people and actions should look like, right? Whether or not that's the case, we think that things should look a certain way. We think, our representatives should look a certain way. We think that teachers should look a certain way. We think that, any sort of professional should look a certain way or do a certain thing. And even talking about, we think garbage people should look a certain way, right? We think people who carry mail should look a certain way, right? All of that is not our own actual beliefs. They are beliefs and ideas that have been given to us by an overarching and ever-present cultural view. And that's the whole thing, is that we're not in a dystopian world. We have created our own dystopian world by being so subservient to what we think culture wants. And to me, that's another really big point of this, right? Is that we are just as subservient as Joseph Gay is, just as subservient as Block is. We are all subservient to what we think we should be doing, instead of just doing what is right. So that's that. That's the trial. Another very long one. 7.5, 8. Pretty high up there. I really enjoyed reading this. Yeah.